For a very long time, the government has not controlled the government.
You must stay at home.
The UK economy shrank by more than a fifth in April.
We have fundamentally broken one of the key aspects of the social contract in this country.
And today, we are the storm.
Power returns to you.
British politics is in a state of crisis. Prolonged economic stagnation, weakening public services, political instability and the housing crisis have created a sense of deep dissatisfaction. In this video, I want to make an explanation of Britain's decline that makes sense of the chaotic events of Britain's recent past. Specifically, I want to look at the analysis of one of the most interesting and controversial figures in recent political history, that of Dominic Cummings. And before we start screaming about Barnard Castle, hold on. If you've only ever heard about Dominic Cummings in the mainstream media, you will undoubtedly hold a seriously negative opinion of him. If you've never heard of him, Dominic Cummings is a British political strategist who most famously helped engineer Brexit. He was the chief advisor to Boris Johnson from 2019 to 2020, and since leaving government has delivered a fascinating and scathing analysis of what he witnessed when in office. Like him or loathe him, Dominic Cummings has been at the heart of the institutions that he criticises, and has therefore seen at first hand how the system actually works versus how it appears to work based on what we read in the media. And what Cummings has to say about the state of British politics is genuinely shocking.
So over the next 6 months or so, everyone's going to be focused on the election. But one of my basic points is I don't think it really matters what happens in the election, that it won't really change some very important fundamentals.
One of the most popular and you might say lazy characterisations of modern British politics is that it doesn't matter who you vote for. What difference is it going to make? They're all the same anyway.
The reason I have never voted in my life is because I think it don't matter which one. We all got excited about Tony Blair. We all got excited about Barack Obama. What happened?
Worryingly, there is a growing sense in Britain that no matter which party takes power, the same set of policies and the same problems just seem to reoccur.
From 1997 to 2010, you had the regime of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. You had what in retrospect is the most constitutionally radical government in British history since Oliver Cromwell. In 2010, the Conservatives came in and they did nothing whatever about it. On the contrary, they actually entrenched it. So your point about the Uni Party, which sounds such a slovenly term, the kind of thing that you say in the pub, actually is true. Mm-hmm. It's a sharp analysis.
For years, the idea that Labour and the Conservatives are so similar they essentially form a Uni Party has been characterised as a lazy and entirely inaccurate description of current political events, where there are real differences between the parties, which you'll see when they come into power. But how can this be the case? It certainly appears, if you listen to what Conservative and Labour politicians say, that they hold real differences about how to run British politics. Enter Dominic Cummings.
Whoever, whether it's Cameron or Miliband who get in, we're going to have someone with very similar education, very similar experience, very similar intellectual outlook. Neither of them know how to prioritise. Neither of them can build a serious team. They're both surrounded by these dysfunctional teams all day, every day. They don't know how to get anything done. They've not had experience in an organisation, watching anyone who really knows how to get anything done in a real alpha organisation that's well managed. They don't understand why Whitehall around them doesn't work. And whichever one wins, we're going to have someone who looks at things, I think, with quite a narrow short-term party advantage, and obsessed with just trying to get through the next news cycle or a few days ahead.
In Dominic Cummings' view, the UK's failure to enact any meaningful change has surprisingly little to do with the beliefs and wishes of the individual politicians themselves. Instead, it has to do with the system. His critique is a critique of the system of Westminster rather than the individual beliefs of politicians themselves. At the core of his critique is a genuinely terrifying observation.
So the first thing is that For a very long time, the government has not controlled the government.
So, simple question, if the government doesn't run the government, then who does? Dominic Cummings, as he was the chief political advisor to Boris Johnson, is often asked by journalists, what did the Minister for Health or Transport say about a specific topic that they were in theory responsible for? And rather strangely, Cummings' response is, I don't remember, and to be honest, it didn't really matter.
People often ask me about 2019 and the Brexit negotiations, what did this minister think about this? What about the rows between this minister and that minister? And my answer to them is, I don't really remember, and it wasn't important.
But how can that be the case? How can the minister in charge for a specific department, how can their opinion not matter to a question pertaining to that department? After all, surely the minister was in charge. Well, perhaps not. If there's one thing that Cummings wants to emphasise above all, it's that the ministers are not really in charge in the way we might think they are. Instead, the people actually in charge are increasingly officials in the form of civil servants, and above all, the head of the civil service, the cabinet secretary. According to Dominic Cummings, the power of the civil service has grown so great that it is they, not the MPs, who actually make the important decisions. The cabinet meetings, the moment in which we assume politicians that we have elected make important decisions about what to do and how to change policy, are in Cummings' eyes almost entirely fake.
I can tell you the decisions are not made in the cabinet. In the whole of 2020, I never even bothered attending cabinet once. The reason is because it's become fake meetings, whereas the real decisions and the real power has moved elsewhere.
So, two basic questions. Who actually are civil servants? And how can it be that they have taken so much power that the opinions of ministers in charge for departments don't seem to matter? If researching this video taught me anything, it's that I didn't actually have that deep an understanding, or much understanding at all, for how the British state actually works and how our constitution works. I think this might be a somewhat common problem where we have a fairly good understanding of who the politicians are and what they believe, but we have very little understanding about the nuts and bolts of how the government actually works. How does it make decisions? How does it change policy? Who's actually in charge? So I thought it would be useful to have a brief summary of how the government works in theory before looking at how it works in practice according to Cummings' analysis. Britain is a constitutional monarchy. We have a monarch as the head of state, but this is, for practical purposes, almost entirely symbolic. Real power is instead held by Parliament and what we call parliamentary sovereignty. We, the British public, get to vote for people to represent us, and these people become members of Parliament. At general elections, the political party that receives enough votes forms a government. The head of the party, the Prime Minister, is then able to select his favourite MPs to take charge of the various departments. In theory, MPs come up with ideas on how to make things better and pass legislation. When it comes to actually enacting legislation, however, politicians obviously need officials to carry out this work, to implement what they want. And here's where it gets interesting. In the 19th century, as Britain expanded its empire, the task of administration became increasingly complex and difficult. Officials used to manage the empire were generally appointed through systems of patronage. In other words, a system in which who you knew was more important than what you were good at. To help solve this problem, a report was published in 1854 by two men, Sir Stafford Northcote and Charles Trevelyan. Fundamentally, the report called for the creation of a more professional body of officials elected by merit and measured by examination. This saw the birth of the modern civil service. Each week, the Prime Minister meets with his cabinet to discuss the key issues and decisions that need to be made. In theory, these cabinet meetings are the key moments in which your views, that of the British public, are supposed to be discussed, with new laws presented to Parliament for a vote. So, this all sounds good. What's the problem? Here's the problem. According to Cummings, these cabinet meetings, the moment in which your views are supposed to be put forward, are almost entirely scripted, and scripted by unelected officials.
They are literally scripted. So when the Prime Minister has a meeting with ministers, what happens is that before the Prime Minister has that meeting, officials go into the Prime Minister's study and they give him a folder. And in the folder at the front is a thing called Chairman's Notes. And that's the script. And that's what the Prime Minister reads out. And the conclusions of the meeting are in the Chairman's Notes, drafted before the meeting happens, right? So the Prime Minister says, hello, Secretary of State, blah, blah, blah. And then all these officials sit around the sides on chairs around the edge of the room. And then the MP, the Secretaries of State, all look down at their folders because they've all got their scripts, right? And this is why I use the NPC meme, right? Because then the Prime Minister reads out, well, we're here to discuss blah, blah, blah. And then he goes around the room, and then Secretary of State for Justice or the Foreign Secretary reads out his bullet points, and then he reads out their bullet points, and they read out. If anyone goes on script, you see the officials sort of go, and then look over at the other official on the side of the room and kind of go, that means we'll come back to that after the meeting and make sure that doesn't happen. And then at the end, it was a fascinating, great discussion. Thank you so much for your wonderful, insightful, original contributions. And then he reads out the conclusions which are all drafted in advance. And it sounds like a parody, but it is literally how the British state functions.
One of Cummings' key points is that the conclusions to these meetings are written before the meeting has taken place, suggesting that the Prime Minister simply reads out decisions which have already been made by unelected officials. The head of the civil service in particular, the Cabinet Secretary, has amassed so much power that he has, according to Cummings, something like 100 times more power than the average minister. Cummings contrasts the older system of government, that of William Pitt in 1795, with our current government.
Whitehall of 1795 was more like SpaceX today than Whitehall of 2024 is like SpaceX today. Pitt had real meetings in number 10 Downing Street, not the fake scripted meetings now where the conclusions are written by officials before the meeting ever happens. That's not a parody from Westminster. That is actually the process for how modern government works. The big battle in Whitehall over power is not what people say in meetings, which are largely fake and irrelevant. The battle for power in Whitehall is about who gets to write the conclusions of what the Prime Minister says before the meeting ever starts.
The first step in understanding Cummings' critique of the modern political bureaucracy is a single point: the idea of ministerial responsibility. Put simply, the idea that in order for an organisation of any sort to be effective, you have to have an individual who is held responsible for enacting whatever it is they want to enact. Now, that doesn't really sound that controversial. That is, after all, how almost any functioning organisation works, whether in the public or private sector. One crucial ingredient of being responsible, of course, is the ability to hire and fire the people you wish to work on the project. Without that, it's very tricky to actually implement and impose your will on any group of people. But any guesses whether ministers actually have this responsibility over their officials?
At the moment, the Prime Minister has literally no role whatsoever in the management of the key permanent secretaries who actually run the government departments. Nothing at all to do with it. The entire HR system of Whitehall works for the Cabinet Secretary, not for the Prime Minister.
Because the civil service is supposed to be impartial, it is considered unconstitutional for politicians to have any say in either their hiring or their dismissal. Cummings' point is that what sounds good on paper works in reality to create a permanent class that promotes almost entirely from within, who then inevitably prioritise protecting the permanent system. Since the creation of a permanent civil service, they have amassed more and more power at the expense of politicians.
Roughly all the most talented people at building things are excluded from our civil service. The politicians you vote for have roughly zero power to hire, fire, or incentivize officials, so they have no real power.
Yeah, so if you think, anybody who's trying to build anything, everyone knows like the single most important thing is for the CEO of, whether it's Microsoft or the CEO of a private hospital or whatever, is can you actually build a team, right? Can you hire them? Can you fire them? Can you incentivize them? Can you train them? And a British government minister has no power to do any of those things with a single civil servant. So you have the ministers are officially responsible to Parliament for what the system does, but they have zero power over the management of the system. So Like nothing in the world that works like that, right? It's like nothing. So we shouldn't be surprised that these things are dysfunctional.
So in this situation, if this is true, if ministers are just faking being in charge of departments, what are the actual consequences in modern life? Here is the fascinating story, now bear with me, of the A66 Northern Trans-Pennine Project. Now, if you haven't kept up to date with this mouth-watering initiative, you can be forgiven. When Dominic Cummings was in government, during Prime Minister's question time, he would take groups of officials and put them in the Cabinet Office and ask them why projects would take 20 to 25 years to do something as simple as add a lane to a dual carriageway. In 2014, the National Highways created a report that recommended an upgrade to a 25-mile section of road that runs from Penrith to Scotch Corner. Lurking somewhere deep in the 275-page document lies a simple proposition: to create a new lane to help ease the flow of traffic. Or, to put this in their terms, support the economic growth objectives of the Northern Powerhouse and the government levelling up agenda. Here, according to Cummings, you witness the state bureaucracy in action.
Even the simplest things like doing a dual carriageway, adding a lane in a dual carriageway over 18 miles is now scheduled to take 25 to 30 years. That is completely normal. And if you sketched out the process, what you would see is start here, planning process 1, court process, judicial review, appeal, environmental process 1, court process, judicial review, appeal, planning process 2, judicial review 2, environmental process 2, that gets you up to maybe 15 years or so. This process continues sequentially, and then the building the road is like that little bit there at the end. That actually happens in like the last few years. That itself is obviously too long. That doesn't need to take 5 years. But there's the 25 years beforehand. Now, this is not a hypothetical example. These are examples that I used when Prime Minister's Questions happens on a Wednesday at 12 o'clock. I used to use that time in the Cabinet room in number 10 Downing Street to bring officials in from all over Whitehall to go through these kind of budgets and to go through these projects to try to figure out why on earth the mad system works as it is. And this is an actual timetable for the A66 road that runs across the north of the country. 1 carriageway for 18 miles in 2020. When I said to them, this is completely insane, go away, come back next week with a better plan, they said, well, Dominic, we've squeezed everything we possibly can. We've done everything that's humanly possible. We think we can get this down to about 23 or 24 years.
There is a distinct lack of ministerial power to bring projects to fruition. Projects that can be delayed, Cummings points out, can be prevented from happening at all. And given the electoral cycle of the average minister may last 5, maybe 10 years, officials that are there permanently, should they not wish to leave, can always outlast the politicians who are telling them what to do. And to be frank, there doesn't seem to be that much authority to tell them what to do, given the power the Cabinet Secretary now has accumulated, which can use all sorts of legal and bureaucratic devices to prevent things from happening at all. The courts are playing an increasingly large role in this process as well. Ultimately, unelected officials aren't really beholden to the attitudes of the people of Yorkshire and Cumbria and the people who will actually be affected by the improvements for this road. So a key point here is that bureaucracies have their own incentives. They aren't necessarily democratic in their outlook. Their incentives tend to be internal. And to be frank, the answer that seems to come again and again whenever problems arises are, we need more resources.
You can't carry on with a system where the political ministers are essentially non-player characters in a video game, and the characters with real power are the unelected officials.
Looking at data from the National Centre of Social Research suggests that there are serious falls in the levels of trust and confidence the British public have towards any politicians, irrespective of whether they are on the left or the right. A record high of 45% now say they almost never trust governments of any party to place the needs of the nation above the interests of their own political party. 58% say they almost never trust politicians of any party. Now, it's important to note that Cummings has more than just criticism. He has a radical plan for how to solve some of these key intractable issues of the British state. I've run out of time in this video to discuss these, but depending on the interest there is in this video, I might go into it in a part 2, because what he has to say about what might need to be changed is genuinely radical, but does offer some cause for optimism. Because the overall picture that he paints, even if 30% of it is true, is incredibly bleak. There are, of course, critics who say Cummings is just bitter that he was ousted from government after the fiasco of Barnard Castle and the fallout from COVID-19. But before making these judgments, I would encourage you to watch some of his recent speeches and the detail with which he speaks and criticises the system that he was so deeply enmeshed in and did try to change. It appears anyway. What he points out raises serious questions not just about the future of British politics, but arguably the future of large-scale democracies at all. There seems to be some indelible rule of bureaucracies whereby over periods of time they grow in size and expand in complexity, demanding more and more resources to do the same if not less work, and that work itself tends to take more and more time. I'd welcome, of course, anyone in the comment section to pose the alternative view, that actually our civil service is supposedly this Rolls-Royce operation that provides fantastic work, and Dominic Cummings does point out that many individuals that are employed in the civil service are fantastically talented, and there are areas within the deep state where there is genuine interest for innovation. The problem is, arguably, in Cummings' eyes, that this change does require the political incentive, and if that doesn't happen, things tend to just ossify and stay the same. I think the recent studies on the overall feelings the British public have towards politicians of all sorts, this isn't really a left or right issue, suggest that these problems are becoming increasingly understood by the British public. Anyway, that's enough of me rambling on. Thank you if you made it this far. If you did like the video, please consider subscribing, and I look forward to seeing you at the next one.